he came very close to being strung up, and it was only because people spoke out on his behalf that he survived.
Upon this river dwelleth Massasoit. It cometh into the sea at the Narragansett Bay where the Frenchmen so much use.
A dreadful storm and hideous began to blow from out the northeast.
Take in the topsail, tend to the master's whistle, blow till thou burst thy wind, broom and up!
Pretty much the first wampanoag that ever walked through these walls. No, I'm just kidding. It's been about 400 years though.
I'm here today with two-time Emmy nominee for Hit and Run History, one of my favorite series, which I want desperately to come back. So that's why I was so excited about Stephano the Butler, produced here by Andrew Buckley. And we've been friends on Facebook for a long time, and I followed your posts and made comments and had a lot of fun. So it's really great to meet you in the virtual flesh and share some of the story of Stephano. I grabbed at it because I was one of those kids who at Thanksgiving time, dressed like a pilgrim, wanted to know the history, but of course it was Americana history. And as you always reveal, Americana history is charming and it has its place in some schoolrooms to help people primer, but the reality is always much more deep and much more interesting. And that's why when I read the relationship between Stephen Hopkins and Stephano the Butler, which is a role I've played in Shakespeare, I was just like, that's a huge connection. And who is this person? And then you're related to him. So can you just kind of give us a kind of overview of Stephano? Is he a drunken butler or is he an adventurer?
Well, he's he's a misadventurer. I think is the way to put it. He is. The interesting thing about him is, he floats ashore on. The ship is caught in a tempest that is created by Ariel, who is acting as servant to Prospero, the sorcerer, deposed Duke of Milan. And no one in this shipwreck is harmed. They all come ashore in different parts of the island, and he floats ashore on a butt of sack, a cask of sherry, and spends the entire play of the Tempest getting progressively drunker and drunker, and less and less charming. As people who get progressively drunker are, and so, and he is, as you may be aware, butler comes from the term bottler, right? The person who serves alcohol, and so the interesting connection there is that Stephen Hopkins had married into a family of tavern keepers. And so, therefore, it argues that he had a background in serving alcohol himself, and so when there are all sorts of parallels here. But let me go back to my own personal connection, and you're talking about in primary school and such. I was in second or third, maybe it was third grade, when my teacher opened up our book for our reading class, and there was a story, and it was November, a story of Giles Hopkins, who was the 13-year-old son of Stephen Hopkins, who had come over on the Mayflower, and somebody else, and they get into trouble, and then he gets spooked a little bit because a Native American is staying in their home in Plymouth. Well, the first thing is that my middle name is Giles. I'm named after him. My mother, born Lucy Jane Hopkins, who grew up on Hopkins Lane in East Orleans, Massachusetts. That's a story that I grew up with. But to add, some sort of significant information to this or twist on this, my teacher was referring to him as Giles, and it was like nails on a chalkboard every time she said that. And so the thing is that, of course, she was the teacher. And I said to my friend, he's like, it's pronounced Giles. And he said, well, she's the teacher, she would know. Like, I know how to pronounce my own name. Thank you very much. But that's the thing, is that, I have to, I since very young, there was the story that I was told. There was the, oral history, basically, in the family. And there was what was being received. And so everybody has their own little twist. And so, if you can't even pronounce if you don't know, if a teacher doesn't know how to pronounce a name correctly, through no fault of their own, because they may have never encountered it, the fact is, what else are you kind of guessing at? What else are you conveying that may or may not be correct? And so in a way, Hit and Run History, and this project specifically, Stephano, the true story of Shakespeare Shipwreck, is all about taking my family story and seeing what truth there is behind it and what might not match up with the narrative. I was told that, yes, when Native Americans came to Plymouth, they stayed at Stephen Hopkins's house. So there's that. And so why? Why his place? Was it the fact that he was a tavern keeper and was used to having people stay over? Was it because, as I had been told, he had been to North America before? He had been shipwrecked on Bermuda and it caused some trouble there, and that trouble became the basis of the Tempest. And then he went on to Virginia, but then he returned home. So what was true and what was going on there, that he was different. He had a different experience than all those, as my family would say at Thanksgiving, which is a very big sort of deal in my family. It was that, he wasn't one of those religious nuts. He was one of the strangers. He was not part of the religious community. So therefore, I was like, well, what made him different? Well, he came from a different part of England. Okay, that's interesting. And so forth and so on. And this is an investigation into that. But more importantly, on a greater viewpoint, it's that we're using him as a vehicle to tell the story of Atlantic exchange during the early colonial period. And we're not just talking about English going to North America. We're talking about people like Squanto and Pocahontas coming to England prior to the Mayflower's departure.
Right. That would have a huge effect on it, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a small circle of people, really. I think sometimes people go, well, but what are millions and millions of people? Actually, no, not at that time.
No, and it's not 6 degrees of separation. It's maybe 2.
Right?
I know somebody who knows Sir Walter Raleigh. I know somebody who knows John Smith. I know somebody who knows, whatever. It's William Shakespeare. Yeah. It's the fact is that, everybody was somebody. Right. That because there were just so few people, and so the actors there. It's also because, to be honest, it's from attrition. When you have a 70 to 90% mortality rate in Jamestown, there's only so much DNA left to go around to be passed down. When you have a 50% mortality rate for the first winter in Plymouth, that makes a big difference. And Stephen Hopkins, who brought his family, which was untouched by that sickness that first winter, he was a family of 5, 6, something like that. And so, out of 50 remaining, so the Hopkinses would have represented 10% of the entire Plymouth colony. So it's believed that up to 1 million Americans trace their descendancy from him.
Wow. That's fantastic to think about, and I think about it too because I know a little bit about the Mayflower because I built a model of it, and of course I've read many accounts, and all those people in that colony were like crammed into. I mean, it was a tiny ship, comparatively speaking, right?
Yeah. It was used for going to get wine. And back and forth to Europe. So it wasn't made for transatlantic voyages. But as compared to the Sea Venture, which was the flagship that left England in 1609, head of a fleet of, I believe, 7 ships, vessels, I should say, going for, it was called the third relief of the Jamestown colony, because Jamestown was failing at that point, and so they were trying to get everybody together. It was lacking practical skills, people who had the ability to make a colony thrive, and it also had a form of government that was different, a little bit more centralized, and that was what Stephen Hopkins was on when it was hit by a hurricane and this fleet was scattered, and the flagship with all the important people was the one that started to sink and was eventually found its way to Bermuda with and everyone survived, just like in the Tempest.
Did Jamestown fail because of that shipwreck? I mean, did it just compound it to the worst degree?
Well, the thing is, a few of the ships that did survive, and 1 or 2 of the vessels that was in that fleet were lost. Smaller ones, and so but the vessels that did arrive there arrived without their head, without that all-important government structure, that new charter that was going to say we're not going to have an elected council where people are bickering all the time. We're going to have an appointed royal governor, and he's going to call shots. And if you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with the king. And if you have a problem with King James, you have a problem.
Problem.
And it was at that time as well that John Smith left. So as these new colonists are arriving without any leadership, the one person who maybe has some sort of handle on how to run the colony successfully is leaving. And so that was the winter of the starving times. So while Stephen Hopkins and the rest of the Sea Venture survivors are living in Bermuda, spending the winter there, building 2 vessels and eating sea turtles and pigs and all the rest, and getting fat, dumb, and happy.
Not a bad place.
Right. The people who made it to Jamestown are dying of starvation. They're in Jamestown, partly because the water was bad. They had founded that fort in a swamp, basically. It had a channel that was nearby, but the water was bad. There was a drought at the time as well, which means the water level was the freshwater level wasn't really that well. So they were drinking brackish water. So people were getting all sorts of dysentery and all the rest. And no food. And the Native Americans had decided that they were just going to try to starve out the English.
It's easier.
Right. And so, and if they tried to leave the fort, they would shoot them. And so people were starving. Some were resorting to cannibalism of the dead. And so when finally those 2 ships are assembled and they sail, it takes about a week or 2, I guess, to go from Bermuda to Jamestown. They arrive there and the place is a shambles. You can imagine they were like, "Oh, we finally got here. Good God!" And so they are getting ready to they pack up the fort and bury the cannons, and they're getting ready to go to Nova Scotia and see if they can find a way home that way. And then the rest of the relief fleet comes with the royal governor, and they're kept there. So it was like, they were literally leaving, just about to leave the Chesapeake Bay when Lord Delaware arrives and says, "Nope, we're going to do this successfully." So the thing is, it was at that point that Virginia survived. If not for that, basically coincidence of timing, it would have the colony probably would have failed. And so and then Stephen Hopkins sinks into kind of a black hole because the records of the Virginia Company burned, I believe, and so nobody knows what he was doing. All we know is that he returned a few years later, because his wife had died and his children were orphaned, and they were put in the care of care of the government, local government, and so he had to return. And for some reason, when he gets on board the Mayflower, he's one of the wealthiest men on board with 2 servants, new pregnant wife, and his family and all the rest. And so we think that he got most of his wealth from having spent that time in Virginia and having gotten some land out of his time in hell, basically.
Well, and that's the thing. He went through that hell, and yet he came back. He came back with, rearmed with a new wife and new kids and
Yep.
and wealth to bring to the new world. I mean, what an amazing thing to do. I mean, I think if I had tasted what had happened in Jamestown, I would have never gone back. I would have been like, no, I'm staying in my comfy home, Northumberland.
Well, it's possible that what he was, on the one hand, it's possible that he inherited his the wife who had passed, Mary, had probably inherited, in some way, he'd come into his share of the tavern that was there and whatever else. And so he may have had some additional equity in that regard. But the fact is that the Mayflower was headed not to New England. It was headed to the mouth of the Hudson River. And it would have gotten, even though there was a small kind of seasonal trading post that the Dutch had, like on Staten Island or whatever, around that area, they hadn't founded New Amsterdam yet. So the thing is, they would have been the founding colony in what we know is New York.
Wow.
So the thing is, if he had been in New York, that would have meant, if they had gone there, but they were blown off course and then couldn't get around the elbow of Cape Cod, if they had gone there instead, I would be a member of one of the founding families of New York, and I would have a massive trust fund.
Huge apartments dedicated to your name.
But I'm not bitter. And it's funny that I grew up and became very on the elbow of Cape Cod. So I'm very familiar with the shoals that kept the Mayflower from continuing further south and west. And instead, when they made the turn and they ended up in Patuxent, as the village of Patuxent, which had been abandoned because of the absolute devastation of the disease that had swept through there and killed 90% of the population of the Native Americans in southeastern Massachusetts. They ended up there, and coincidentally, it just so happens that that was the village of Squanto, who had been in England years before. So if not for that connection, they probably would not have survived. It's very possible that the colony would have not have survived. And the interesting thing that we point out, the most interesting thing of the film, as far as I'm concerned, is the idea, when we looked at the timelines, Stephen Hopkins was back in England. He was in London getting married at the same time that Squanto was living, just a dozen blocks away or so, because he had been kidnapped and was learning English and basically providing intellectual property, a capital to investors and people who were in company. So the idea is that Stephen Hopkins, having been to North America, had information that was very valuable. Squanto did. Is it possible that they had? It was very likely that they were running in the same circles professionally.
It seems like
more,
it, right?
But could they have met? And if they had met in the 16 teens in London, what would it have been like when Squanto walks in 1621, in the spring of 1621, walks into Plymouth? Stephen Hopkins is there. Is it possible that they said, "Hey, I know you. I've met you before"? It's never mentioned, but it's really interesting, and
it has to be. It has to be.
And then that whole thing of the Native Americans stayed at Stephen Hopkins's house. And
Yeah.
Squanto was the one who ended up living in Plymouth anyway. It's like there's some familiar.
Yeah, even in England, I have to think, it's like, you've been to the New World. I mean, how many people have been to the New World at that time? A handful, and survived.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And if he was living in London, is it possible that he was, he was also, talking to people there, because they would want to know what's Virginia like? What's North America like? Well, this Stephen Hopkins guy was there. There aren't too many people around who have been there before. Mm-hmm. And so again, this is all pre-Mayflower.
Yeah.
And in fact, he would have been very attractive to the Mayflower, to the separatists who were going there, that congregation, because they said, we've got one guy on board. If we can recruit him to be a member of our colony, he's got invaluable information.
That's the guy.
He's the guy. And so therefore, and he's got some money. So it's very possible they cultivated him.
Yeah.
And not the other way around.
See, that's the thing. History's when it gets down to it, it's just small. I mean, it's like this person knew this person who heard about this person, because there weren't phones. Everybody talked, so you had to remember conversations. Yeah. Not like now.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing: is that a lot of this stuff happened. This exchange of information. Where did it happen? In taverns.
Right. Kiss the book.
Exactly.
And who was serving the liquor?
Yeah, who was serving? Who would have known? And it's just lots of likelies and maybes and stuff like that. But if nothing else, it makes a good story. But more importantly, it makes it a good intellectual exercise, because now what are we doing? We're talking about that period of history. We're talking about what ifs. What ifs are what drive people to find answers.
That's right. That's the main thing. That's where discovery happens. It's like, because I do it even just briefly, even just before I got on this call with you, I was thinking of tying tangents together, both from what you had said and what I saw in the documentary last night, which is just wonderful, beautifully done. Some great comic moments, but some real heavy ideas too, about what it meant to be brought back and forth and live as they lived, and the people who sacrificed their lives,
Right. And the thing that the what we try to do in all of our hit and run history work is not to be the last word on a subject, but realizing we're probably the first word. In other words, we may be introducing you. Now, we're not introducing the story of the Mayflower. We're not introducing the story of Thanksgiving. We're introducing the fact that there's one guy who may have had connections with Squanto, and that allows us to tell Squanto's story in part, and then be able to connect it up with William Shakespeare and his final play, which has all sorts of interesting connections to it. The Tempest is not a documentary. It's almost like we say, it's like Law and Order. It's grabbed from the headlines.
Yeah.
And there's some good stuff in it, but he doesn't. But it's not verbatim. And so, but there is some great stuff in there that Shakespeare would have glommed onto. He's like, yeah, I'm going to take that. I'm going to take that. I'm going to add some other things, and add some other characters. And so that is good, because that then sends young people, which is focused. The target audience is younger viewers. You can tell that from the pacing. You can tell that from the music that we use. It's to be able to spark their minds, and to be able to say, maybe they'll go to the library, maybe they'll go to Amazon, maybe they'll go look it up on Google, or talk to their teacher about it, and say, hey, I saw this thing last night, and what's this? And whether they're interested in drama, whether they're interested in history, whether they're just interested in travel or whatever else, it's a way to be able to introduce greater ideas. And so that's why this film isn't a story about Stephen Hopkins. It's the story of us following the story of Stephen Hopkins, our crew, as we go. And and sometimes we get lucky with interviews or being given access to things, and so you're along for the ride. It's the adventure of discovery. And so you get that, and then that means that you can apply that sense to other ideas as well.
Well, and it's funny too, because one of the things that while I was watching it, and there are a lot of great jewels that you never knew that just stick out at you just from the interviews that you do and history that you uncover, in the documentation. But the thing that struck me about that time period is it's very much like now. In some ways, an empire needing to find a new way to express itself, by looking to the new world, the US reaching to space to try and do this, and people just living, in all kinds of various religious contrasts, and people were dying if they were Christian, and then they were dying if they were Catholic from one decade to the next, and there's a little bit of that in the US, not religion so much, but the connection between cancel culture and technology versus human feelings. It seemed similar to me in some ways, the way people were disconnecting in order to get to the new world. It's like no, this has to happen. We have to colonize.
They're getting siloed. They're siloing themselves, and so the thing is, you have people from one particular group heading into Virginia, and you have people from and they're gonna form their colony and their structure in one way, rather aristocratic, rural, and then you're going to have another one based in New England, which is more theocratic, but also kind of designed upon, and in some ways theocratic and sometimes congregational, and they're going to have a different settlement pattern, and that's going to eventually play itself out, in the American Civil War.
Yeah,
because it's all 250 years later, it's the fact is that but each colony having its own little, it's an enclave, and we can see those today forming, in the great sort. People sorting themselves through social media, geographically as well. It's people are able to do that. They couldn't do that before. They had to live all together on this little island nation. But when they found another place to be, they sorted themselves.
Yeah, quickly, really quickly, and that's another parallel to today that I love. That brings up a question, and you're the perfect person to ask. And it's a little selfish of me because it's outside the realm of your documentary, but it just kept me thinking. If humans lived another 100 years, like if we lived to be 200, do you think our history would be any better? Because it seems like people die who start so much because they can't complete their vision.
Well, I think if people didn't die of disease, you would have things differently. I think certainly, if the settlement patterns, especially in the South, especially in the Caribbean, that were based upon the idea of a high level of mortality of laborers, then there wouldn't have been the switch from indentured servants, white indentured servants, to Black Africans, which then fed upon itself. If labor is cheap and such, then you're going to treat it differently. You're going to view it differently, and then you add a couple hundred years of that attitude over and over and over again, and you're going to look at people differently than if they're going to stick around for a while. Because if they're going to stick around for a while, maybe you don't want so many of them.
That's true. If they all live 200 years, you'd only need
you're gonna take a different attitude about it. So I think that's it. It's if people were impervious, more impervious, if life isn't cheap, then you're going to do things differently. You're going to organize your society differently. And in fact, that I think that's a way that New England versus the South is that there wasn't a lot of great fertile land that the South could just kind of use up farmland and then move on and it moved rapidly across from the Tidewater across into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth rapidly. As compared to in New England, it was, this area is crappy, we're going to go to sea instead. And then you treat human life a little differently. Wasn't enlightened, but it certainly isn't. It's treated differently. For example, if you're aboard a ship, and the same thing is Bermuda, is the reason why Hopkins' life is spared, and people who are grumbling and getting into trouble, their life is spared, is because you can't, if you're going to run a ship, you need human beings. You can't just cut their heads off or hang them or whatever every time, because eventually you're going to run out of people
in the middle of the ocean.
That's something you can't negotiate. Yeah. You have to have someone who will run up and grab a line, someone who will do one thing or another, and you just can't do that. And therefore, in the opening scene of the Tempest, you have the bosun telling the nobles to get below. You're in the way. And and they're all affronted. It's like, well, dude, you are endangering the ship just by standing here. I'm a person of expertise, and I'm going to save your life, but you have to get out of my way. Yeah. Let me do my job. And that is an interesting thing, because that voyage itself, it shows, it's like, well, position is great and all, but it's not helping me in the storm.
Well, I love it. I'm excited. I enjoyed every minute of it last night. I was like, oh, okay. I'm giving up the rest of the evening to thinking about this, because I'm half Latino. I've worked. I've thought about border. I thought about the conquistadors and the conquering of Mexico for many, many years, and that's why the Pilgrims always kind of stuck out at me too, because they were like the anti-Latinos, but not really. It just seemed that way when I was young. But now, looking at the whole thing, and watching the documentary, it ties together not only the Tempest, which is also a transition story about the power of Europe changing hands, and the church losing its role as the main wizard, as it were. There's just so much great. That's why I just love the play. Caliban, the island native, who is himself divorced from his own mother. It's just it just seems so much like today, from a little micro story, to what was actually happening, where he got the micro story, to 2020, 2021, where we have to reassess everything that we are. So I can't recommend it more. Now, your video is available, not only, it's going to be broadcast on PBS, correct, in Southern California.
This weekend, it is premiering on PBS SoCal and KCET in LA. So that's our West Coast premiere. It's happening this weekend, and we're moving on to more things. So, but it is available for rent on Vimeo. You can go to just look up Hit and Run History on Vimeo, and
I'll put the link below. Yeah, it's like $4.99. It's well worth it. Because it's 90 minutes that you don't mind losing. And I think it's for the whole family. I think it really is. Go ahead. Yeah, it's made for the family. It's made to be, a couch conversation piece, I thought,
Yeah, and a number of people I've heard have watched it, and then they go back and watch it again. There's so much more. It's very dense, but it's very fast paced, and so therefore you can miss some. You can miss some things, but you go back and watch it again, and people are like, "There's even more here." So I mean, we could have done an 8-hour multi-night Ken Burns style thing, but we had to, get it into a manageable piece with post production. So it's 90 minutes that's paced like a bat out of hell. So I think people will enjoy it. We've certainly got great feedback from this, and we're looking to hear what people in Southern California have to say about it.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Do you have another one in mind? It seems very hard to top a family relation that touches all points of history.
Oh, well, there are a few things that are going on. We do want to continue pursuing the story of the Columbia expedition, the first American voyage around the world. That's going to that's going to be needing a bigger budget than what we have and right now. But that this vehicle is this project as a vehicle to be able to help us launch us into bigger things, it opens up all sorts of possibilities. But this was one we've been holding in our back pocket for a while, and it was time. It was time to pursue it.
Yeah, totally. And can people donate at Hit and Run History?
The best thing they can do, besides, of course, by renting it, it goes into our fiscal sponsor, the 501c3 of the Cape Media Center. So that money goes there. The other thing they can do is to go on our hitandrunhistory.com site, and they can purchase swag on Teespring. Spring, it's now known as Teespring. So they can have like this. I survived Shakespeare Shipwreck t-shirts, sweatshirts, yoga pants, and such like that. And so, but I just happen to be wearing this right now. But it's a good sweatshirt. I like it. I got a lot of compliments for it. People thought it was a band. I was like, yeah, okay, fine. But yeah, these. But they can go on there and order them, and that's a good way to support us as well. So Andrew, buy our swag.
Andrew, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this project. It's thrilled me since I first started reading about it. I'm glad to hear that it was broadcast further. I feel in some ways I've been in a bit of a cocoon this year. So I'm glad that I finally discovered it and brought you onto Moulangeme and Classical Archives to talk about it, because it just hits deep with our people. The music from that time period is also lush and wonderful. We're going to put a little playlist to it. I love early music, especially early Elizabethan music, because it's codified, even with Christian messages to Catholics.
Yes, yeah. No, it's. I mean, but it was, some of it was simple, some of it was ornate. It depends upon basically who was in power, at the time. So. But yeah, and this has been my pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me through our Facebook page or Instagram, feel free.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
We'd be all right if the wind was in our sails.